The prison cafeteria fell silent the moment the new inmate walked in. He was old, calm, and didn't look like he belonged there. That's all the gang leader needed to see before he smirked. "Hey, Grandpa," he said, blocking his path. "You lost your nursing home?" The other inmates laughed. The old man didn't. He just stood there, eyes steady, breathing slow. Then with one move, the tray clattered. The gang leader hit the floor and the laughter stopped. No one knew it yet, but the man they were mocking wasn't just another prisoner. He was a retired kung fu instructor with a past that could break every bone in that room. The steel doors of Riverside State Penitentiary clanged shut with a sound that echoed through every corridor like thunder. It was a sound that broke men before they even saw their first cell. But when 72-year-old Daniel Chen heard those doors close behind him, his expression didn't change. His weathered hands remained steady at his sides, his shoulders straight despite the orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his lean frame. The intake officer barely looked up from his paperwork. Another old-timer caught up in the system. Probably some white-collar crime, nothing unusual, nothing threatening. But if that officer had looked closer, he might have noticed something different about Daniel Chen. The way he moved with purpose, even in shackles. The way his eyes took in every detail without seeming to stare. The way his breathing remained controlled and measured despite being in one of the most violent prisons in the state. Daniel had been a free man for 72 years. He had taught martial arts for over 4 decades, owned 3 successful dojos, and trained everyone from scared teenagers to seasoned police officers. He had lived a quiet, disciplined life built on respect, honor, and ancient teachings. Now he was prisoner number 84291, and the next 5 years of his life would be spent behind these concrete walls. The cell block Daniel was assigned to was controlled by one man, and everyone knew it. Victor the Bull Martinez was 6'4", of pure intimidation, his pale skin covered in tattoos that told the story of 2 decades behind bars. His crew moved through the prison like they owned it, and in many ways they did. Victor had built his empire on fear and violence. He decided who ate and who went hungry. He determined which inmates got protection and which ones became targets. The guards looked the other way because Victor kept order in his own brutal fashion, and that made their jobs easier. When word spread that a new fish was coming to the block, Victor's interest was immediately piqued. Fresh meat meant fresh opportunities to remind everyone exactly who ran things in Cell Block D. The first time Victor laid eyes on Daniel, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. An old man, probably older than his own father would have been, gray hair, wrinkled hands, moving slow. This wasn't just easy prey. This was a gift. Daniel's first night was quiet. He made his bunk with military precision, organized his few belongings, and sat reading a worn paperback book until lights out. He didn't speak to his cellmate, a nervous young man named Eric, who had been counting down the days until his own release. "You seem different," Eric whispered after the lights went dark. "Most new guys, they're scared or angry or trying to act tough. You're just calm." Daniel closed his book and set it aside. Fear and anger cloud judgment. Clarity comes from stillness. Eric didn't understand what that meant, but something in the old man's voice made him feel safer than he had in months. The next morning brought Daniel's first trip to the cafeteria, and Victor was waiting. He had positioned himself and his crew near the entrance, making sure every inmate would have to walk past them. Daniel entered the cafeteria, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity he had maintained since his arrival. He moved to get his tray, his eyes scanning the room with practiced awareness. The food was exactly what he expected. Watery eggs, burnt toast, coffee that looked like it had been sitting since yesterday. He took what was offered without complaint and began looking for a place to sit. That's when Victor made his move. "Well, well, well," Victor's voice boomed across the cafeteria, causing conversations to stop and heads to turn. "Look what we got here, boys. Somebody's grandpa got himself locked up." Daniel continued walking, his tray steady in his hands, his expression unchanged. Victor stepped directly into Daniel's path. His massive frame blocked the way to the tables. His crew flanked him on both sides, grins spreading across their faces. "I'm talking to you, old man," Victor said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "When somebody speaks to you in here, you answer. That's how respect works. Daniel stopped walking and looked up at Victor calmly. I heard you. I just don't have anything to say. The response caught Victor off guard. Most new inmates either cowered in fear or tried to act tough. This old man was doing neither. He was just standing there, completely unimpressed. You don't have anything to say? Victor repeated, his voice getting louder. Maybe you don't understand how things work around here. See, I run this block. That means everything that happens here goes through me, including where an old fool like you gets to sit. Daniel remained perfectly still, his breathing slow and controlled. Years of meditation and training had taught him to find calm in the center of any storm. I understand. You're the man in charge. I'm just trying to eat my breakfast. Victor's face flushed red with anger. The old man's calm was making him look weak in front of his crew, in front of the entire cafeteria. That couldn't stand. Without warning, Victor reached out and shoved Daniel hard in the chest. The force should have sent the elderly man stumbling backward, but Daniel's feet seemed rooted to the floor. He absorbed the impact, shifted his weight slightly, and remained standing exactly where he had been. Victor blinked in surprise. He had put real force behind that shove, but the old man hadn't budged. Did you just... Victor started to say, but Daniel cut him off with a look that made the gang leader's words die in his throat. For just a moment, Daniel's mask of calm slipped, and Victor caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. It was like looking into the eyes of a predator that had been pretending to be prey. The moment stretched like a taut wire. Victor stared into Daniel's eyes and felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years behind bars. Uncertainty. But Victor was the king of Cell Block D, and kings don't back down from challenges, especially not from some elderly man. You think you're tough, old-timer? Victor snarled, stepping closer. You think those tired bones can stand up to what I got waiting for you? Daniel's response was barely above a whisper. I think you should let me eat my breakfast in peace. The cafeteria had gone completely silent now. Every conversation had stopped. Even the guards at the far end of the room had noticed something was happening, though they weren't moving to intervene. Not yet. Victor's crew was getting restless. One of them, a wiry man with tear tattoos named Jake, stepped forward. Victor, you want me to teach Grandpa some manners? But Victor held up a hand. This was personal now. Nah, I got this one. What happened next would be talked about in whispers for years to come. Victor drew back his massive right fist, putting every ounce of his 250 pounds behind a punch designed to shatter the old man's jaw. It was the kind of blow that had dropped men half Victor's age. Daniel saw it coming from the moment Victor's shoulder tensed. 43 years of martial arts training had given him an understanding of body mechanics that went beyond conscious thought. The punch was powerful but telegraphed, thrown with emotion instead of technique. Time seemed to slow as Daniel's body moved with fluid precision. His left hand came up in a gentle arc, deflecting Victor's punch just enough to send it harmlessly past his head. At the same moment, his right palm struck forward with surgical accuracy, connecting with a pressure point just below Victor's sternum. The technique was called Iron's Breath. Applied correctly, it could disrupt balance and stop breathing without causing permanent damage. Victor's eyes went wide as the breath exploded from his lungs. His massive frame folded in on itself as he dropped to his knees, gasping like a fish out of water. The breakfast tray Daniel had been holding clattered to the floor. The silence in the cafeteria was deafening. Jake and the rest of Victor's crew stood frozen, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Their invincible leader was on his knees in front of an elderly inmate who looked like he should be playing chess in a park somewhere. Daniel looked down at Victor with something that might have been pity. I asked you nicely. All I wanted was to eat my breakfast. Victor struggled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and rage. The humiliation burned worse than the pain in his chest. Every eye in the cafeteria was on him, waiting to see how the king would respond to being dethroned. You, he wheezed, pointing a shaking finger at Daniel, are dead. You hear me, old man? Dead. But even as he made the threat, Victor knew something had fundamentally changed. The aura of invincibility that had protected him for so long had been shattered in front of everyone. Daniel picked up his spilled tray and walked calmly to the serving line to get a replacement meal. The inmates parted before him like water, their eyes following his every movement. Some looked at him with newfound respect, others with curiosity, a few with the kind of fear they had once reserved for Victor alone. As Daniel found an empty table and sat down to eat, conversation slowly resumed around the cafeteria. But they were different now, hushed, careful. The power structure that had governed Cell Block D for years had been turned upside down in the span of 30 seconds. Victor and his crew retreated to their usual corner, but the swagger was gone. They huddled together, speaking in low voices, planning their revenge. In a place like this, what had happened couldn't be allowed to stand. Daniel ate his eggs methodically, seemingly oblivious to the storm gathering around him, but his awareness was absolute. He could feel the hostile stares, hear the whispered conversations, sense the violence building like pressure in a steam pipe. He had hoped to serve his time quietly, but 40 years of teaching martial arts had taught him that some conflicts were unavoidable. After breakfast, as inmates filed out of the cafeteria, several men approached Daniel. Some wanted to shake his hand. Others offered protection. A few even asked if he would teach them what he knew. Daniel politely declined all offers. He had learned long ago that in places like this, allies could become liabilities in an instant. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But as he walked back to his cell, Daniel knew that his quiet wartime was over. Victor wouldn't let this slide. And when he made his move, it wouldn't be a fair fight in front of witnesses. It would be brutal, decisive, and designed to restore his reputation through Daniel's destruction. That evening, as Daniel lay on his narrow bunk reading his book, Eric whispered across the darkness of their cell, "Is it true what you did to Victor? They're saying you're some kind of kung fu master. Are you really trained in martial arts?" Daniel closed his book and set it aside. For a moment he was quiet, lost in memories of a different life, training sessions that lasted until dawn, students who looked up to him with respect and admiration, a world where his skills were used to protect and teach, not to survive. "I was a teacher," he said finally, "for a very long time." "What did you teach?" "Discipline, control, how to find strength in stillness." Eric was quiet for a while. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely audible. "Victor's going to come for you. Him and his whole crew. They can't let what happened today stand." Daniel stared up at the ceiling. He had known this moment would come from the instant he decided to defend himself in the cafeteria. The only question was when and how Victor would make his move. "I know," Daniel said simply. "Aren't you scared?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "Fear is just information. It tells you to be prepared, but it doesn't have to control your actions." The next morning came with the sound of cell doors sliding open. Daniel rose before the wake-up call, as was his habit from decades of early morning training sessions. He folded his blanket with precise corners and prepared for what he knew would be a different kind of day. Word spread through the prison like wildfire about yesterday's incident. As Daniel walked the corridors toward the showers, conversation stopped. Eyes followed his every step. Some inmates nodded with newfound respect. Others quickly looked away, not wanting to be associated with the man who had humiliated Victor Martinez. The shower room was nearly empty when Daniel arrived. The hot water was a luxury in this place, and he let it run over his weathered shoulders as he reflected on the path that had brought him here. A tax evasion charge, 3 counts of failing to report cash income from his dojos, the kind of white-collar crime that usually resulted in minimum security facilities and early release. But overcrowding had landed him in Riverside. As he dried off and dressed, Daniel heard footsteps approaching, multiple sets of boots moving with purpose. He didn't turn around, but his reflection in the metal mirror showed him everything he needed to know. Jake entered first, followed by 2 other members of Victor's crew. They spread out in a semicircle, blocking the only exit. "Morning, Grandpa," Jake said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Victor wants to have a word with you." Daniel continued buttoning his shirt, his movements unhurried. "I figured he might. Smart man. See, what happened yesterday, that was embarrassing for all of us. Made us look weak in front of the whole block. Can't have that. I understand your position, but I won't be going anywhere with you." Jake's grin widened, revealing yellowed teeth. "Wasn't really asking, old-timer." The first man moved forward, reaching for Daniel's arm. What happened next was so fast that Jake barely registered it. Daniel pivoted on his back foot, his hand shooting out in a swift chopping motion that struck the attacker's wrist with surgical precision. The man cried out and stumbled backward, clutching his arm as feeling left his fingers. The second attacker rushed in from the side, swinging wildly. Daniel ducked under the punch and drove his elbow upward into the man's solar plexus. The breath exploded from his lungs. He doubled over, gasping like a landed fish. Jake backed toward the door, his eyes wide with disbelief. Two of Victor's best enforcers had been neutralized in less than 10 seconds. "This ain't over," Jake snarled as he helped his injured companions to their feet. "Victor's got plans for you. Big plans." "Tell Victor he knows where to find me," Daniel replied, straightening his shirt once more. "I'll be in the library." The library was Daniel's sanctuary in this concrete hell. Rows of worn books lined the walls, donated over the years by churches and community groups. Daniel had found a corner table where he could sit with his back to the wall and a clear view of all entrances. The librarian was a soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Park, who had worked at Riverside for over 15 years. She had seen inmates come and go, witnessed violence that would haunt her dreams, but she had also seen moments of genuine transformation. Something about this elderly man intrigued her. "You're different from most of the men in here," she observed, as Daniel returned a book on Eastern philosophy. "We're all different, Mrs. Park. Prison just strips away the pretenses that hide those differences." "You speak like an educated man. What brought you to this place?" Daniel selected another book from the shelf. "Poor choices and good intentions. The road to this place is paved with both." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other inmates. Daniel noticed them immediately, men he didn't recognize from Victor's usual crew. Hired muscle from other blocks, brought in to handle a problem that had grown beyond Victor's ability to solve internally. Mrs. Park sensed the tension immediately. "Perhaps you should go. I can call for guards." "No need," Daniel replied softly. This was always going to happen. The hired muscle approached with the swagger of men accustomed to intimidating others. The leader was a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and scars that spoke of countless violent encounters. They called him Crusher, and his reputation preceded him. "You must be the old man causing all the trouble," Crusher said, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "Victor Martinez sends his regards." Daniel closed his book carefully and set it aside. "I suppose talking this through isn't an option." "Talking time's over, Grandpa. You embarrassed the wrong man." The library erupted into chaos as other inmates scrambled for exits. Mrs. Park retreated behind her desk, reaching for the emergency button, but Daniel knew that help wouldn't arrive in time. Crusher moved with surprising speed for his size. His massive fist cut through the air toward Daniel's head, but Daniel wasn't there when the punch arrived. He had slipped to the side, his movement so smooth it seemed like he had simply faded from existence. The old man's counterattack was swift and precise. His palm struck Crusher's kidney with enough force to drop a normal man, but the giant barely grunted. Years of prison violence had hardened him beyond normal human limits. Crusher spun with a back fist that splintered the wooden bookshelf where Daniel's head had been. The second attacker joined the fray, swinging a makeshift weapon fashioned from a toothbrush handle and razor blade. Daniel caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted sharply, and heard the satisfying crack of breaking bone. The weapon clattered across the floor as its wielder collapsed, screaming, but Crusher was relentless. He grabbed Daniel in a bear hug, lifting the smaller man off his feet and squeezing with enough force to crack ribs. Daniel's vision began to blur as the air was crushed from his lungs. In that moment of crisis, Daniel's training took over completely. He drove his thumbs into pressure points along Crusher's arms, disrupting the nerve signals that controlled grip strength. The giant's hold loosened just enough for Daniel to break free. Daniel dropped to the floor and swept Crusher's legs, sending the massive man crashing into a table that collapsed under his weight. Before Crusher could recover, Daniel was on him. His hand positioned at the giant's throat in a hold that could render him unconscious in seconds. "Yield," Daniel said quietly, applying just enough pressure to make his point clear. Crusher's eyes went wide with panic as he felt his air supply being cut off. He had never been in a position where his size and strength meant nothing. "I yield," he gasped. Daniel immediately released the hold. The library fell silent except for the groaning of injured men and the sound of approaching boots as guards finally arrived. "What happened here?" demanded Sergeant Collins, the head of security for Cell Block D. "Disagreement over a book," Daniel replied calmly. "It got out of hand." Collins looked around at the destruction, the injured inmates, and the elderly man standing calmly in the center of it all. His experience told him there was more to this story, but prison politics were complicated. "Medical attention for the injured," Collins ordered his men. "And you," he pointed at Daniel, "solitary confinement, 48 hours." Daniel nodded acceptance. It was a small price to pay for sending a message that would echo through every cell block in the prison. The old man wasn't just dangerous, he was unstoppable. As guards escorted him away, Daniel caught sight of Victor Martinez watching from the corridor. The gang leader's face was a mask of rage and frustration. His hired muscle had failed spectacularly, and now every inmate in Riverside knew that Victor's reach had limits. Solitary confinement was 8 feet by 10 feet of concrete and steel, a narrow bed, a steel toilet, and walls that seemed to press inward with the weight of isolation. Most inmates emerged from solitary broken, their minds shattered by the crushing loneliness. Daniel used the time to meditate, to center himself for what he knew would come next. Victor couldn't let this stand. His reputation was built on fear, and fear required constant reinforcement. He would come himself this time, bringing his entire crew and any allies he could muster. When Daniel emerged from solitary 48 hours later, the prison felt different. Conversations stopped when he passed. Even the guards treated him with cautious respect. Word of the library incident had spread beyond Riverside's walls, carried by transferred inmates and visiting family members. Eric was waiting in their cell, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "Man, I thought they might never let you out." "The whole block's been talking about what you did to Crusher. Victor's still planning his next move, though. Is he?" Daniel asked, settling onto his bunk. "Oh, yeah. He's called in favors from every gang in the prison. Aryan Brotherhood, Mexican Mafia, even some of the black gangs that usually don't work with whites. He's promising them territory, commissary money, whatever it takes." Daniel nodded grimly. This was exactly what he had feared would happen. His actions in self-defense had escalated a simple bullying situation into something that could tear the entire prison apart. "How many men is he gathering?" 20, maybe 30. All serious players with nothing to lose. Daniel closed his eyes and tried to find the center of calm that had sustained him through decades of teaching and training. But for the first time since arriving at Riverside, he felt genuine concern settling on his shoulders. 30 violent men armed and organized, for one elderly martial artist who just wanted to serve his time in peace. Even with all his training and experience, Daniel knew that some battles couldn't be won through skill alone. The question wasn't whether he could survive what was coming. The question was how many others would be hurt in the process. That evening, as word spread through every cell block and tier, Daniel sat quietly on his bunk, knowing that tomorrow would bring the storm he had been trying to avoid. The whispers carried details of Victor's growing alliance. Names of dangerous men from every corner of the prison who had agreed to participate in what was being called the biggest coordinated attack in Riverside's history. Eric paced nervously in their small cell. "Man, they're saying Victor's got guys coming from maximum security. Lifers with nothing to lose. Why don't you just ask for protective custody? Get transferred out of here." Daniel looked up from the meditation pose he had assumed on his thin mattress. "Running away doesn't solve the problem, Eric. It just moves it somewhere else. But this isn't your fight anymore. This is war." "It became my fight the moment I decided not to let Victor pour my breakfast on the floor," Daniel replied calmly. "Everything that's happened since then has been a consequence of that choice." Eric stopped pacing. There was something in the old man's voice, a certainty that spoke of a man who had faced impossible odds before and found a way through them. "You really think you can take on 30 guys?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "When I was younger, I might have believed I could. Age teaches you humility. But sometimes you don't fight because you think you can win. You fight because it's the right thing to do. The lights went out at 10 sharp, plunging the cell block into darkness. The morning came with an eerie quiet that settled over cell block D like fog before a storm. Daniel rose at dawn as he always did. But today felt different. The air carried tension so thick you could taste it. Eric had barely slept. They're coming today. Everyone knows it. The whole prison's holding its breath. Daniel nodded slowly, folding his blanket with the same precise movements he had performed every morning for months. Then today, we find out what we're really made of. As the cell doors opened for morning count, the usual shuffle of feet and murmur of voices was replaced by an unnatural silence. Inmates moved carefully, keeping their heads down, sensing that something explosive was about to happen. Daniel walked to the cafeteria with measured steps, his breathing controlled, his mind centered. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on him, some filled with curiosity, others with fear, and more than a few with the hungry anticipation of spectators waiting for blood. The cafeteria felt like a powder keg. Victor sat at his usual table, but today he wasn't alone. The faces surrounding him told the story of every alliance he had forged, every favor he had called in. Aryan Brotherhood soldiers with swastika tattoos, Mexican mafia enforcers with dead eyes, black gangs who had set aside their usual hatred of Victor's crew for the promise of territory and respect. Daniel took his tray and found an empty table in the center of the room. Not hiding in a corner, not seeking protection near the guards. Right in the middle where everyone could see him, where there was nowhere to run. The attack came without warning. Victor's signal was subtle, just a slight nod of his head, but it unleashed chaos. Men rose from tables throughout the cafeteria, moving with coordinated precision toward the elderly man sitting calmly with his breakfast tray. What happened next would be whispered about in prisons across 3 states for decades to come. Daniel moved like water flowing around stones, his body shifting and turning with fluid grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The first attacker's knife thrust met empty air as Daniel stepped aside, his palms striking with surgical precision at pressure points that dropped the man instantly. 2 more came from his left, swinging makeshift weapons with lethal intent. Daniel ducked low, swept one man's legs, and used his falling body to block the other's strike. His elbow found ribs. His knee found a solar plexus. Both attackers crumpled. The room erupted into complete pandemonium as more men joined the assault. But Daniel was no longer fighting individuals. He was fighting the mob itself, using their numbers against them, turning their aggression into a weapon that struck down their own allies. His movements were poetry written in violence, each technique flowing seamlessly into the next. Decades of training had prepared him not just for combat, but for this exact moment when skill would face overwhelming odds and emerge victorious through pure discipline and understanding. Guards rushed in with riot gear, but they found something they had never seen before. One man standing calmly in the center of a room filled with groaning, defeated attackers. Daniel's orange jumpsuit was torn, but he was unharmed, his breathing steady, his hands at his sides. Victor lay unconscious near the overturned tables. His grand alliance shattered along with his reputation. The king of Cell Block D had been dethroned not by another gang leader, but by a 72-year-old man who had simply refused to be intimidated. In the weeks that followed, Daniel Chen became a legend within the walls of Riverside State Penitentiary, not because he sought power or control, but because he had shown that true strength comes from discipline, that real power flows from inner peace, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the least threatening. He served the remainder of his sentence without incident, teaching meditation classes in the library and showing younger inmates that there was a path beyond violence. When his release day finally came, Daniel walked out of those steel doors the same way he had walked in, with quiet dignity and unshakable calm. The lesson he left behind echoed through every cell block. Never judge a man by his appearance, because you never know what kind of power lies beneath a gentle exterior. Sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones who choose not to fight until the moment comes when they have no other choice.